Our guest today is Jim Mosquera, principal at Sentinel Consulting, a business reconstructing and capital acquisition firm. He also operates the economic and financial website called The Sentinel. In the late 1990s, Jim realized there was something amiss in the stock market. In his recent nonfiction work, Escaping Oz series, he shows why proposed solutions for financial and economic problems miss important points. Today, he shares some of those points and how we can have an honest discussion to work through some of these financial difficulties. Find out more about Jim and his work at jimmosquera.com. Hi, Jim. Welcome to Savvy Business Radio for our Heartbeat of the World video series. I'm so grateful to have you out here today. You're going to share about your wonderful series of books. You have a number of books that are dealing with finances and really giving people a deep understanding of what our financial system is all about and how we as citizens of this country can make it better. And before we go to all that, what really brought you, because you had told me you're an engineer by trade, what really brought you to looking deeper into our financial industry and building this wonderful series and helping the public understand it better?
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned I am an engineer. I have 2 degrees in engineering and industrial engineering, and my professional life was in the telecommunications world. But I always had a keen interest in money, and that was kind of one of my electives in college. I spent a lot of time in money and banking and so forth. And then when I got out of college, I started trading commodities on futures exchanges, kind of on the side. So always had a very, very keen interest in money, started to learn a little bit more about the Federal Reserve. And at some point, again, after understanding, what our money was really all about, which is not really totally understood, applying kind of that engineering discipline, that objective kind of practical way to kind of take a problem, break it down, kind of like I was taught, and then try to find a solution for it. And so that's the purpose of the book series, is to kind of create that educational platform for people to have discussions, because as we just talked about off the air, we have a lot of political discord right now, obviously, in society. I mean, that's very evident. And as I was mentioning to you, what's scary is that you have a lot of that political discord right now, yet a lot of economic statistical measures are actually very, very good, at least for the moment. And so what the book series, it really talks about that intersection of politics and economics. And so right now, we don't really have too much of that intersection going on yet. We have a lot of the politics, but we're not feeling a lot of the economics yet. I understand, the recovery has not been the same for everybody, and that's something that I mentioned in the book as well. But yeah, very, very important, as you mentioned, to kind of understand that foundational process.
Well, that's honestly, that's why we're having you here today and a number of other experts talking about this, because what I saw during the whole election process and then even afterward, where people were like, your mama, and disowning their husbands or wives or daughters because of their candidate. And I looked at it as your team was not winning or was winning, or my team's better than your team. I'm like, people, seriously. I've been saying this for more than 8 years, that either Republican, Democrat, whatever you want to call it, are the same team, and they're not working for the United States of America. People, stop looking at your team being better than another. Let's look at how citizens, us, the people, can make this country better and make it prosperous again, but really prosperous for all, not just some. But I really feel it comes from us, because a guy I met several years ago said, at this point in time, if we were to have a Martin Luther King come into the scene and do what he did in the 60s, it's not possible that one man can come in and be the political leader that can just transform everything. It has to be every single person doing their own part. And what I loved about your book so far that I've been reading, because I haven't been able to read it all, is that it really does deconstruct the whole system and allow you to see how it all intertwines together and how we all play a part in the construction of it, because it isn't just the Federal Reserve or the government. It's all the bits that come together. And share with the audience a little bit about all the different books in the series and what each of them stands to try to get out to the public. What is your great goal with each of them?
Well, the first book, which was published in 2011, is called Escaping Oz, Protecting Your Wealth During the Financial Crisis. And we were, I guess, a couple of years removed from it. And the successor book, which is the one you're reading right now, which was published in 2015, Escaping Oz, Navigating the Crisis, because I kind of felt like we were still kind of going through the crisis, even though for some people it didn't necessarily feel that way. For others it did. The book that I just released yesterday, May 12th, 2017, is called Escaping Oz, An Observer's Reflections. And that is more, let's say, call them a series of very, very short articles that people can read, and you don't even have to read them in order, but really to get you to think about some things. And it involves less money topics, the new book, and probably more things like societal issues, government, politics a little bit more, because all those things factor in as well. But there's always a money element to them, but it's less about money. So the first two books, again, they're kind of create that foundational knowledge so we can have intelligent, and I emphasize intelligent, rational discussions about how to solve problems, because we're clearly not having that now, and unfortunately, Washington now is being distracted by by other things, Russiagate, the firing of the FBI director, and unfortunately those things, and I'm not saying they're not important, but they tend to distract from what I'll call the true foundational problems that plague the nation today.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I found interesting, even your talk about money in general, from debt to credit. For me, I thought it was interesting when you mentioned your book that credit needs to exist in our credit system right now because it feeds off each other. In order to keep the credit system going, you have to create more credit. And then I thought, for me, inflation. Another thing you touched in your book, that inflation is really not just due to more money being printed or being put into the system, but it's much greater than that. It's also more credit being put into the system. But, I didn't know that. So, I mean, there's just so many takeaways I'm learning in every chapter as I go, that it really is a deep thing. And even myself, for the past couple of years, I think I told you before when we got started with the interview, that I went bankrupt a couple of years ago with my first business. And I had thought things were going to, turn around after the bubble and I could quickly get back on my feet, and I couldn't. But part of it is our own, as you said, confidence in credit equals, credit equals confidence. And I was confident that things would get better. Then when things start to not do so well, bankruptcy and such, I start to pull back, use more cash and less credit. And I'm continuing to do that. And that causes people to go out and buy less goods and services. And it kind of is a big cycle. Speak a little bit to all of this.
Yeah. So the very first chapter of the book, it talks about money, and there's a reason why I started the book series with money, because money is the foundation of a lot of these problems, because we do not have we don't have good money. We have something that's called fiat money, and fiat basically means it's by decree. So somebody says, okay, this thing that you have, this green piece of paper that's in your wallet, is worth X because it has a numerical value to it. Now that piece of paper in and of itself doesn't really represent anything, and that's where when you talked about credit equals confidence, which is my first economic laws. I have a series of 4 economic laws, and that's the very first one: credit equals confidence. So you have confidence that green piece of paper you can take to a merchant and exchange it for something of value. But what the problem is that over the course of time, the definition of what we call money has been greatly altered. Now, some people may say, well, what's the big deal? The big deal is that entities like the Federal Reserve, and we'll throw the federal government in that as well, have the ability to create these massive amounts of credit, and that credit in and of itself, as we talked about off air, can go to what I'll call credit cones. And so if you create all this credit, and that credit goes to real estate, or it might go into the stock market, that tends to create these financial bubbles. And even though we're always going to be subject to financial bubbles, because that's part of the human condition, and you, as you read in the book, that's part of the psychology of investors, these bubbles are greatly exacerbated by our financial system the way it exists today. And so when you talked about, you had a personal experience with money where, you had bankruptcy, and then you retrenched. Well, if our system does not continue to create a certain amount of credit, it starts to create these deflationary conditions. And that's something that occurred very much so after 2008, or during 2008. That was the financial crisis, was that you started to have this debt implosion. And so rather than letting that process happen, which, again, that could be a whole subject of debate, the Federal Reserve stepped in. And so the Federal Reserve, has a balance sheet, just like, you do in your business, and, you have a certain amount of assets. Well, the Federal Reserve started with, assets before 2008. I'm just using my hands here for example, where maybe they had assets on their balance sheet of $400 billion, and those assets more likely were treasury securities and so forth. Well, after 2008, if you look at a chart of what their asset looked like, it greatly expanded. So now their asset sheet looks like $4.5 trillion. Well, that essentially was money that didn't exist before. It got created out of thin air, that went out in the marketplace and bought something. Okay, and then that something was, treasury bonds, treasury bills, so treasury securities, mortgage-backed securities, other things that they bought. Had they not done that, there would have been a debt implosion associated with those assets. And so that's what's really important to understand, is that if you have an honest money system, something like that could never happen, because you really couldn't create money out of thin air. Yeah. And that's part of what I'll call the wizardry. That's the magic of the wizards, is that they can create money from thin air and then buy assets that they deem very, very important to maintain financial stability.
Yeah, it's interesting, because I think people listening would be like, well, that's fabulous. They just made more money. I wish I could print money in my basement. I'd have an awesome life. But what they don't realize...
You'd be in jail.
You'd get caught for sure, and you'd be in jail. But what's interesting about it is that if we all did that, then the money would lose its value. And that's something your book touched on, is that the more money you have in the system, there's too much of it, and it becomes less valuable.
Well, and so what happens is, if you have a certain amount of money in the system, or credit, however you want to call it, and it's chasing X number of goods, once you add to that pile, and via credit, the wizard's creating that, so you have more money essentially chasing the same amount of goods, and that gets back to that credit cone that I was talking about. So if all that money that gets created starts chasing stocks, well, guess what happens to stocks? The dollar value of those stocks starts increasing, because there's more of those dollars that chase it. Same thing with real estate. I see I see other bubbles that they're popping up right now. And the automobile credit is another big bubble that you see right now. The student loan market, another huge bubble. Now I believe student loans are north of $1.3 trillion. And probably since 2008, I would venture to say that amount of debt has probably more than doubled. Yeah. So again, that's money, credit that didn't exist before, that got created. And again, you can argue where there's always the argument, well, if money can be created like that by the federal government and the Federal Reserve, is it going to the right things? And this gets into some other issues like income inequality, which is very, very pervasive in the United States and in the world. All of those things are affected by it. And I just don't think people realize that, because the root cause of all this is the defective money system that you have.
Yeah. And see, here's another thing. One of the biggest topics that people love to talk about on Savvy is money and sales, because there are a lot of business owners listening in. And of course, it affects everyone. I think there was this one business mentor who said, money is number 2 after air. And for people who are going to start saying to me, no, other things are important like family and health, it's like, yeah, I get it. But you don't have any of those if you don't have money first, because everything in our society, in our Western society, from buying food that you need to keep you healthy, from going to the doctor, to buying water even, is all done with money. So if you don't have money, you ain't going to be living very long.
And I'm glad you mentioned the small businesses, because my primary business is actually helping small businesses with finance, capital acquisition, and debt restructuring. So if they go to a bank and they're not able to get capital for whatever reason, then they need to go to a secondary market, or people like me with it. I can help them with that sort of financing. But one of the things that is very, very telling about our economy is, and I wrote an article about this 2 years ago for small business magazines, is that the number of small businesses in the United States, so small business births and deaths are going in the wrong direction. You have many more deaths than you do births. And so if you think that, and I think probably universally agreed that small business is, the employment creation engine in the United States, if you want to promote that. But if small businesses aren't being created, then that means that employment has to be taken up by larger and larger entities. And so what I've seen is I've seen a deterioration. You see the small business successes, like you're from New York City, so when Snap has their IPO, it's like, well, this is a great success and so forth. Yeah. But most businesses aren't like that. I mean, the businesses that I deal with a lot of times are kind of smaller mom and pop shops, or they might be multi-million-dollar businesses, but they're not big businesses by any stretch of the imagination. And I can tell you for a fact, a lot of these businesses that I've dealt with are operating on very, very, very close margins. Their margin of safety is nil. And so our credit system has not really done a lot of benefits for a lot of these small businessmen who still have a very, very hard time getting capital. And after 2008, the regulators basically overlaid, more restrictive policies and regulations on the banking system to protect from what? Another financial crisis. Well, the problem is that, I had a client, this is a true story, that they had $1 million line of credit with a local bank. They wanted to expand that. And the bank really was very reluctant to do that. They called me and they said, hey, can you help them out? So we did help them out, but it wasn't like this business was not paying on time. I mean, they were good, but from a regulatory standpoint, a regulator looked at the finances for this business and said, you know what, it might be better, Mr. Banker, if you just take that one off your books. And that's exactly what they did. And so that's the kind of thing that I've seen, at least in my business, over the course of the last couple of years. And again, I mean, eventually all that ties back to a defective money system.
Yeah, it's so interesting you mentioned that, because that's part of what happened to me. I started my business with a great line of credit, thinking that if anything happened, I could rely on the credit to keep me going. And they ripped it out from underneath me after the bubble, saying, well, we're not going to take a chance on you because we know things are doing badly. And when you start doing badly, you're going to start taking that credit and you most likely won't be able to pay it. So we'll just take it from you. And then when they did that, then all my other deals started plummeting and I couldn't keep things running. And it was a big mess. But,
well, and moreover, Christina, the other kind of significant event for the banking system is, what do you have now that you didn't have before? Well, you have back in the late 90s, even mid 90s into early 2000s, you had a lot of bank consolidation, right? Mm-hmm. Now you have even more of it. So you have fewer banking institutions that are available, which means that each bank is a little bit larger, and so they may be less willing to deal with a small entity. So what you've mentioned here, I've seen time and time again here where I live, where big businesses all of a sudden were dealing, or even small, medium-sized businesses were dealing with larger banking entities that basically didn't want their business anymore.
Yeah. And this is interesting to me. Tell me what you think. I don't know if you've read this book called We Defy by Tommy Attaway. If you haven't, I'd really check it out. It's really cool. But he mentioned in his book about starting a money system built on sound money, which we originally had, and really built on gold and silver, precious metals. Is there any way we could get back to something like that? Is that possible?
Yeah, absolutely. And, this is not necessarily a prediction, because one of the things that happens if you go back to sound money, it imposes some significant financial discipline on the people in Washington, D.C. In your case, your state capital is Albany, I believe. For me, it's Jefferson City. It imposes some financial discipline, fiscal discipline on government entities that they haven't had to deal with before. Mm-hmm. And that's something that would cause, some major stress, in the state capitals and in our federal capital as well. And it would take a great deal of adjustment. But can it be done? Absolutely. I mean, during the next crisis, however that might occur, if there's a loss of confidence, and we talk about credit being equal confidence, so if there's a loss of confidence in money, now it hasn't happened in this country, I mean, you've seen it happen in other countries, then you have to come up with something that people have confidence in. If you're in the country of Venezuela right now, that Bolivar that you're carrying around isn't worth anything, and that they have to keep adding more zeros to it. And if you lived in Zimbabwe many years ago, and you had to carry around a $10 billion note to buy, some small grocery item, that's the epitome of a lack of confidence. So if you get to that point again, there's several ways to potentially do that. One of them is, as you mentioned, you have to tie something that has some, what I'll call intrinsic value to the money. And again, it's not to say that you're going to be, instead of, I'm going to open my wallet here for effect. It's not to say that, okay, well, instead of carrying, this $5 bill around, I'm going to have to carry around pieces of gold and silver, and that's how I'm going to pay the merchant down the street. No, that's not what that means. It just means that piece of paper or the coin or whatever you have represents something of value, because right now it doesn't. I mean, if you look at any piece, any dollar, any paper money that we have, it'll say this note is legal tender for all debts public and private. You'll see that definition changed over time. And for some people, well, what's the big deal? It is a big deal, because it tells you what the value of that is. So there is an absolute way to do that. As you mentioned from that other author, you would have to basically remonetize all your money and say, okay, this piece of paper now that you have that's $1 is the equivalent of, 1/1000th, I'm just throwing out a random figure, 1/1000th of an ounce of gold. Oh. And moreover, that if you took that dollar bill to a bank or maybe even a Federal Reserve branch and said, okay, hey, I want to exchange this for 1/1000th of an ounce of silver, which, that doesn't exist, but let's say they had a coin that was that small, that
Mm-hmm.
they would be obligated to give you that.
Mm.
That imposes an amount of fiscal and financial discipline that we don't have.
Yeah.
The closest thing that you kind of have to that right now, and I talk about that a little bit in the new book,
Mm-hmm.
are these cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin,
Yeah.
which, it's still not perfect. There's some imperfections to it from the standpoint of a really good money system. But essentially what you have there is, again, something that doesn't get created arbitrarily. I mean, you have to go through a mining process to create Bitcoins.
Mm-hmm.
But it's that sort of discipline, where something's just not fiat. Say, okay, well, it's just going to be worth this.
Yeah.
Because once you do that, it creates, it's really hard to overstate this, but it has so many effects on, what we do with domestic policy, foreign policy, our military. There's so many things that are tied to it, just because there's no fiscal discipline that's required by government to do anything. And if we reach the point of no confidence, then that's where everything has to be reset.
Yeah, I get it. And that makes total sense. What I liked about you touching on is a little bit of the Great Depression. You mentioned how we got to a point where, out of necessity and survival, people had to go back to the barter system and not even use cash anymore. There were stores that would, you trade me some of your egg and I'll give you some milk here, or whatever it might be, because it got to the point where that was necessary in order to eat and live. And so the barter system, like you were saying in your book, and like we've come to realize, is not proper for everything. If you had a bike, as you mentioned in your book, you can't break that bike into a bunch of other little bits and say, hey, I'll give you half a bike for this. So you had to use some sort of money system to make that possible. And that's the whole reason we even have money system today. Is there anything citizens could start to look at as far as bringing it more to a sound money system? Maybe petitioning their government for a more sound money system. Is there anything average citizens can do to start moving in a better direction?
I would say move number one, and obviously this is going to sound self-serving, but really understand more about what you have now. And, whether you read my book or anything else, understand what that process is, because you're not going to be able to do that by yourself. It'll have to be done through, a legislative process, right? And, you can look at the Constitution right now and it says Congress is the one that's authorized to, to coin money, and it has to look like this. Well, that's not what it looks like right now. There was a Federal Reserve Act that came into play in, 1913. So it has to be done legislatively, but there's no will to do that, because I think, anyway, politicians know that once you do that, it tends to put some clamps around, what their abilities are. Which, again, if you read my new book, you'll probably look at, we live in a land that is just full of laws, rules, and regulations, and it's so easy to break, break a rule. Anyway, I'm kind of getting digressing a little bit, but yeah, it's an educational process. For some of your listeners or viewers right now, I want to alert them to a process that's coming into play right now, which coincidentally, in my fictional books, the Chandler Scott series, I alluded to this, and I developed this more in the third novel, and it's called an Article 5 convention. And an Article 5 convention is a way to actually change the Constitution more through what I'll call a grassroots citizen effort, where you come up with these potential amendments that you want to pose in an Article 5 convention. But in order to do that, you have to start that at a state process. So in your case, you'd petition your legislators in Albany and say, hey, I want you to join the Article 5 convention, and we're going to talk about, and this is a real live thing that's going on right now, by the way. One of them is like term limits that they're going to discuss. Another one is kind of reining in the power of the federal government to return more of the power to the states, which I believe is probably something that needs to happen, because you have so much political discord right now at a national level that it may be easier, again, from a constitutionally mandated process, to settle it at a state level. So that when I talked to the Article 5 people, because I had some meetings with them here a few months ago, I told them that I think it would be helpful for them to introduce an amendment to the Constitution that talks about making money more sound again, and so some of these proposals have been introduced and from a legislative perspective in Washington, D.C., but they just never go anywhere, and that's because there's no will to do it. And so it really has to start out, I believe personally, at kind of more at a grassroots level where people understand this process a little bit more. And if I might say, I think some people are beginning to understand that right now as they start to use cryptocurrencies, and they realize, there's some way that I can exchange for goods and services over here, and I'm not using, these green pieces of paper, and I'm not using the banking system.
Yeah.
And the banking system's kind of caught on to that, and they realize, hey, cryptocurrencies are here to stay. So to answer your question, it's really more of an educative process that has to occur at a grassroots level, and then people pushing that up through the legislative process at the state, and then probably hopefully beyond that.
You know what's interesting to me, Jim, because I've actually read the Constitution. Most Americans have not read our Constitution, which is pretty sad. But honestly, I feel like if we were to just eliminate all the laws that went against the original law, aka the Constitution, the land of the law of the land, it would be pretty much operating in a lot better way. I mean, it would be a state-to-state basis where we, the people, would be making the laws, and we'd have our officials working for us, not the other way around. Is there any way, instead of adding amendments, to really go back to the true structure of the Constitution? Wouldn't that be maybe easier?
Well, and I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I started out the book I just released yesterday, Escaping Oz and Observer's Reflections, with kind of like starting out from scratch. And I said, if you were in this bazaar, and in this bazaar, this marketplace, you sell one thing, I sell something else, what are the things that you really need? And I mentioned that, you need obviously money, because, to get away from barter, but you need, civil laws to make sure that the vendors that you're dealing with are doing what they said they were going to do. I mean, that's the basis of civil law. And then you need criminal law to make sure that, someone isn't trying to steal your goods, someone isn't trying to mess with your property. And so if you think about the three things that you really need just to have a functioning society is you need, the money, you need civil laws, and you need criminal laws. Really, anything beyond that is more than you technically need. Now, I understand that there's need for rules and regulations above that, but we have so many of them now, and let me give you a real quick example of what I'm talking about when we have too many laws. There's a case that I cite in this book that I just released yesterday, where there's a man with his family, and they're at a beach on the Gulf Coast, and I don't mention the state or the city or anything, and the kid's making his sandcastle, everybody's having a good time, and a couple of cops come by and they say, well, you have to stop what you're doing. And so, because you're breaking the law. And so I paused there for a minute to have people kind of reflect on, okay, well, what's going on here? Is there some sort of a wetland here that he's interfering with? Is it child labor? What would cause, two policemen that are on the shore patrol to tell a kid to stop doing that? And so, the dad comes and says, well, can you explain what's going on? The police get a little bit belligerent with them. And the dad says, well, can you show me what law it is that says that you're not supposed to do this? And the police can't, come up with that. 20 minutes later, 4 more patrol vehicles showed up, 2 SUVs, and then 2, I guess, ATVs show up. So now there's a dad, the mom, and a kid that's probably less than 10 years old, kind of debating this whole thing. Well, what ended up happening was the city council decided to vote on this regulation that said that you couldn't build these sandcastles greater than 2 feet in height, because I guess a couple of years before there were some rowdy kids that had been there for spring break, and that there had been some, let's say, illicit activities occurring. Anyway, my point is that you have something as innocuous as building a sandcastle that caused the problem. And this gentleman who was questioning all this was told not to question it, and eventually he got fined. I mean, he got fined a couple $100s for not complying. So the point is that we have way too many laws. We've asked government to do way too much, at the federal level or at the state level, and so. When we the people keep asking government to do more, guess what's going to happen? We're going to get more. We're going to get more rules. We're going to get more laws and more regulations. And then the problem is that you don't even know when you might be breaking it. So, you might have to hire somebody to, say, oh, am I in compliance with this, and this? And so it becomes a very, kind of a very convoluted system. And, if I'm a politician and people are, hey, I need for you to pass a law to do this. I need the tax code to do the following for me. I mean, the tax code is probably the seminal example of, how things have become so convoluted. So I honestly, we need to step back, we need to do less. And answer your question about, well, should you go through the Article 5 process? I do that. I think that's a good legal constitutional path to follow, because it'll at least return power closer, to where it's going to have an effect, and I do believe that in many cases the federal government's not the best entity to decide, what rule and regulation should apply, let's say in my backyard, and you probably feel the same.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've seen a lot of crazy laws come on the books the last couple of years.
I deviated a little bit in the book that you're reading, Escaping Oz, Navigating the Crisis, and I have a chapter in there that's towards the end, and I call it, What Should Government Be? And I honestly want people to think about that, because what do you want? And when I say government, I'm really thinking more of the federal government. What do you want the federal government to do? Because again, as I mentioned earlier, the more you ask them to do, the more they're going to try to do. The more they're going to try to do, the more it costs for them to do that. And the more, it costs them to do that, the more, people they're going to need, the more layers of regulation and rules that you need on top of that. So we need to have, an intelligent, rational, non-political national discussion on what you think the role of the federal government should be. And until you have that, it's gonna be really hard to kind of corral this leviathan that's the federal government. And when you have a defective money system, I mean, that government can continue to expand. Now, what's that limit of government expansion? That's the $64,000 question that we don't know. I mean, imagine that you've got the side of a mountain and you've got all this snow accumulating on the side of it, and you have these snowflakes that hit it. Well, this snowflake, no, it's not going to cause the avalanche, and several snowflakes keep hitting it. You don't know which is the one that causes the avalanche. When that avalanche gets released, God save everybody that's in front of that avalanche underneath it, right? Because it's going to completely envelop it. And that's the fear that I have right now, is that, there's a lot of these snowflakes that are hitting the side of the mountain and creating, these mounds of snow. I don't know which snowflake is going to be that unleashes all that. And that's what we really need to be prepared for. And we need to start that process right now. And again, I see this political discord that we have right now, and it's really arguing about a lot of things that may or may not be totally economic. But when the economics get laid on top of it, the closest thing that I see right now in Washington that's really that argument of politics and economics is the healthcare issue. And I touch on that lightly in the new book. But yeah, so it's just part of the educational process. People really need to care about where they live, and and really think about what they want their government to do.
Yeah, and just think about what kind of life do you want to leave for your children, your grandchildren? Because right now, I mean, I think if you go to work on a day-to-day basis, there's one guy I talked to who works in the Texas, councilman in Texas. He said, well, honestly, every day we all break the law. Because there's so many laws on the books that we break them without knowing them on a daily basis. We just don't get picked up and hauled off to jail. But do you want to live in a society where there's 1,000,001 laws that you're breaking every single day? Or do we want to live in a society where we can be our best and put our gifts and talents into the world the best and create a great life and country for everyone? Well, I think it's totally possible, and I thank you so much for coming to share some of your insights and wisdom on this. Let everyone know where they can get your books and find out more about you. Share that with them. Yeah,
I would say the good central place to come find out more about my nonfiction series, which we've been talking about today, but my fiction series is based on this character named Chandler Scott, and it's a thriller that kind of deals with politics, financial crisis, cyber terror. Are we hearing a lot about cyber terror lately? And it kind of talks about some of those principles of liberty, kind of that conflict that the government's going to have. There's some other themes in there about, I'll introduce a term here today, maybe that doesn't exist, a cyber secessionist that I bring up as a character in the second novel. My website, my author site is www.jimmosquera.com. So that's Jim, Jim, Mosquera. So that's JIMMOSQUERA.com. And there you can find out, all about my books and where to get them and so forth.
Wow. Well, this has been truly educational and wonderful. Thank you so much for coming to share this great wisdom today on Savvy Business Radio for our Heartbeat of the World video series. Thank you so much, Jim.
It's been great being with you this morning. Thank you.